In this segment of the Continuous Disclosure 101 series, we'll be discussing the disclosure related to corporate governance. We will begin by discussing what is corporate governance and the importance of its disclosure before diving into the disclosure requirements, including who is required to provide corporate governance disclosures, what is required to be disclosed, and we'll take a closer look at independence and finally where the disclosure is required. As a general reminder, the videos included as part of this series are intended to only be a general introduction to each topic and are focused solely on the requirements under Alberta securities legislation. We remind issuers that the securities exchange that they are listed on may have their own policies and rules regarding the timely disclosure of material information, and we encourage issuers to seek legal advice with respect to their specific circumstances. The views expressed in the presentation are those of the presenters and may not represent those of the ASC, other securities regulators in Canada, or staff. Corporate governance refers to a system of practices developed to promote transparency, accountability, fairness, and ethical behavior in how a company operates and makes decisions. Effective corporate governance can help mitigate conflict of interest, reduce risk, and improve decision-making processes within the organization. Much of the disclosure requirements in NI 58-101, Disclosure of Corporate Governance Practices, focuses on the board of directors, including its composition, its mandate, the role of continuing education, and consideration of the steps the board has taken to encourage and promote a culture of ethical business conduct. In addition to the disclosure requirements, NP 58-201, Corporate Governance Guidelines, provides guidance on corporate governance practices formulated to achieve a balance between providing protection to investors and fostering a fair and efficient capital markets and confidence in capital markets. These guidelines are not intended to be prescriptive, and reporting issuers are encouraged to develop their own corporate governance practices. Finally, issuers should also become familiar with NI 52-110, which sets out requirements with respect to reporting issuers' audit committee, including its responsibilities, composition, and related disclosure requirements. Disclosure considerations pertaining to audit committees will be included in a separate segment of the Continuous Disclosure 101 series. Again, while corporate law imposes certain obligations on directors and officers, this presentation will focus on those obligations under securities law in Alberta. Part 2 of NI 58-101 details that both non-venture and venture issuers are required to provide corporate governance disclosure. Non-venture issuers must provide the disclosure required by Form 58-101F1, and venture issuers must provide the disclosure required by Form 58-101F2. I'll provide more information as to where issuers should include these forms later in the presentation. Now that we know which forms need to be filed, let's take a look at the similarities and differences between the two. Both forms require the following disclosure: the identification of the independent board members and those that are not, situations where director is presently a director of any other issuer that is reporting issuer must be disclosed, description of any measures the board takes to orientate new members and provide continuing education to members, description of the steps taken by the board to encourage and promote a culture of ethical business conduct, description of the nomination process for directors, discussion of how compensation for the directors and CEO is determined, disclosure of the standing committees and their function, discussion as to how the board assesses that the directors and committees are performing effectively. Non-venture issuers are also required to disclose the board mandate, details regarding the roles and responsibilities of the various positions of the board, whether or not the issuer has adopted term limits for the directors on the board or other mechanisms of board renewal, and a disclosure of the representation of women on the board and in executive officer positions. As noted on the previous slide, issuers are required to consider and identify its independent board members. In general, a director would be considered independent if they do not have a direct or indirect material relationship which could, in the view of the board, be reasonably expected to interfere with the exercise of the director's independent judgment. Examples of circumstances in which a director may be considered to have a material relationship with an issuer include, but are not limited to, the following: an individual who is or has been within the last 3 years an employee or executive officer of the issuer, an individual who is a partner of a firm that is the issuer's internal or external auditor, and an individual who received more than $75,000 in direct compensation from the issuer during any 12-month period within the last 3 years. On this slide, we have included several questions that an issuer could ask to help it determine if a director is independent. As each situation is unique, these questions are not intended to be an exhaustive list of considerations. Form 58101 F1 and F2 are not to be filed as standalone forms. Determining where to include the form and the corresponding filing deadline has been simplified using this decision chart, which can be followed by both non-venture and venture issuers. The first question to ask is, does the issuer send a management information circular to its security holders? If yes, the issuer should include the completed form within the circular. The large majority of issuers will fall into this category. If the issuer does not send an information circular, it must determine if an annual information form, or AIF, will be filed. Non-venture issuers are required to file an AIF, but it is voluntary for venture issuers. Section 6.2 of NI 51102 states the AIF must be filed 90 days after year-end. Finally, if a venture issuer does not send an information circular or file an AIF for the period, the form must be included in the annual MD&A. Subparagraph 5.1(2)(a) of NI 51102 states the MD&A must be filed 120 days after year-end. There are other securities laws requirements that engage corporate governance requirements beyond the scope of this particular presentation. For instance, NI 51101, Standards of Disclosure for Oil and Gas Activities, contains provisions for the Reserves Committee and Board approvals, the internal controls and certifications discussed within NI 52109, Certification of Disclosure in Issuers' Annual and Interim Filings, which is a separate segment featured in the Continuous Disclosure 101 series, and the related party requirements for related party transactions under MI 61101, Protection of Minority Security Holders in Special Transactions. This concludes our overview of corporate governance disclosure, which forms part of the Continuous Disclosure 101 series. Other videos in this series can be found on our website, and if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to the contacts listed on that page.